So I actually want to start off with a little exercise. Can I see everyone's hands, please? Yep, amazing. Now, can we clasp those hands together? Yeah? So there's usually like a dominant thumb on top. Let's reverse that around a little bit. Put the other one on top. How does that feel? Awkward? Weird? Uncomfortable? Cool, that's what this presentation is going to feel like, so I've already primed you. You can unclasp your hands. So I want to start by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, whose land we are gathered on here today. They are the traditional custodians and owners of the land, and I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. I was actually born on land belonging to the Kawasim clan. I grew up on the lands of the Caddo, Comanche, Cherokee, Kickapoo, Delaware, and Tonkawa people, and I currently live and work on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. Now, as I clarify my social identity influenced by geography, I know there's a couple of things you're thinking. There are biases, stereotypes, and assumptions hidden behind all of these words. And honestly, it's not really your fault. We live in a world where we've constantly been pitted against two halves of things. Evolutionarily, we've been programmed to see things as us versus them. And this used to be an awesome mental shortcut to help protect us from danger, but it's actually evolved with us as a species, to the point that in the early 1970s, two British social psychologists, Henry Tafel and John Turner, explored a phenomenon called minimal group paradigm. They investigated the minimal conditions required for discrimination to occur within a group. And what's amazing is how little it takes for discrimination to occur within a group. Something as basic as pancakes versus waffles. The minimal group paradigm finds us saying, oh, they're the kind of people that like waffles. And then we actually start to build on that. We start to make the members of the them group or the out group as homogenous as possible, saying things like, oh, they like waffles? They probably don't put the toilet seat down. On top of that, we start to use selection and confirmation bias to keep it this way. But what if instead of seeing things as two halves, we start to see them as spectrums? We think about spectrums in neurodiversity quite a bit, but we often fail to apply them elsewhere in our lives. So if we go back to that example of pancakes versus waffles, what if I said you could start to see those on a spectrum? What if I said you didn't have to choose? You could be both simultaneously and right in the middle. So I'd actually like to share some examples of this as it relates to design. I'm going to start off with a spectrum talking about communication. I'm going to start off with what I call a cave designer. This is a designer who, I think we probably all know at least one of these, is a person who goes into their cave, they hide their work until it's perfect, and then they emerge to then share their work. And this person usually emerges at a design crit, to show, oh, like, look what I've done. And often the work is actually really high quality, right? But it doesn't always take all the research into account because they've been hidden in their cave. So this person, outside of a design context, might also be called a brilliant jerk or an asshole genius. Yep. On the other side of the spectrum, we have an overcommunicator. This is a person that could be a little bit of a micromanager at times. They really want to see every step of the process and make sure that it is correct. And I will fully admit this has been me. I work in a very collaborative environment, and I will over-communicate because I want to make sure everyone knows everything all the time. So when we start to look at these two halves, we really want to start to look at their motivations, right? For a cave designer, it's really about a fear of failure. The cave designer is operating in a way that they want to make everything perfect and then present it. So there's a lot of ego involved in that. versus the micromanager is also actually operating from a fear of failure because they're fearful that there's not enough communication, and if something goes wrong, it's either going to reflect on themselves or someone on their team. Now, when we put them on a spectrum, what's really interesting here is that they're actually quite similar. So there's a theory in political science called the horseshoe theory that asserts that when the extreme left and the extreme right, rather than being on opposite sides of the spectrum, because they're so extreme in their extremeness, they actually start to resemble each other, right? And so we don't actually want to play in that space. Ideally, we actually want to be kind of at the top of that horseshoe. So I want to borrow from a Japanese concept here called kintsugi. And essentially, this is the Japanese art of repairing broken pottery by mending the areas of breakage with powdered gold, platinum, or silver. And as a philosophy, it treats breakage and repair as a part of the history of the object rather than something to disguise. Now, why can't we take this concept and apply it to our design? What was the last time that you showed the cracks in your wireframes and how you were fixing them? And to build on this, there's another concept called wabi-sabi, which effectively translates to perfect in its imperfection. And it's a worldview centered on the acceptance of transience. Now, I really wouldn't be a designer if I just, gave you one spectrum and just left you. So let's add a little bit more context and complexity to this. So while we're thinking about communicating, we're also often thinking about our ways of working, right? We're constantly thinking, but also doing. There's a marination of ideas, but then there's also that pixel pushing and that executing that happens. And when we start to see these on a spectrum, it actually looks very similar to something that we already do. When we find that balance between what we're working on that's challenging, but we already actually know how to do, we're finding our flow. We're going into our zones. And so when we start to layer these two spectrums in the way that we work, how do you see yourself here? Your team, your organization. Where can you find creativity, not only in your communication, but also your flow? But I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't tell you how this changes over time. When we think about someone quite junior in their career versus someone quite senior, and the different kinds of problems they might be tackling, we start to see this on a spectrum, right? We might be choosing to focus on pixel problems versus people problems. And how do we develop or keep our beginner's mindset when we're actually supposed to develop expertise? And so when we start to layer that with our previous two spectrums, you might be looking at me and just thinking, holy crap, how do I start to balance all of this? And so I want to leave you with this phrase, which one of my professors from grad school said and just has really stuck with me. Perfection doesn't really come instantly, so why are we trying to achieve it? A core part of our design process is actually iteration, right? We're iterating on our communication style, we're iterating on our ways to achieve flow at different points in our career. And so creativity doesn't have to be sudden. It can be tinkered into existence. And so this naturally leads us into the conversation of how are we tinkering things into existence, right? So let me introduce you to another spectrum that I think is probably top of mind, which is automation versus individual craft. And I know that there's a lot of people in this room that are probably really terrified of a Gattaca-like or a Black Mirror-type future. But honestly, it sits on one side of that spectrum, right? Versus the other, where things might have been more analog and we're looking at individual craft. Now, we're probably sitting in the middle of this, in the present, terrified. But if we look at the spectrum, how can we creatively approach this? We hotshot designers go around touting principles of co-design and participatory design, but what if we actually co-designed with ChatGPT? We talk about digital consciousness, so you just found another thing or person that you can interact with. And the same way that we train our colleagues and give them 360-degree feedback to actually make them better, we could actually do that with our AI models. And if everything goes to shit, I really think you could make ChatGPT your minion. Delegate all of those tasks, those repetitive tasks, right? The ones you don't want to do, give it to ChatGPT. You've just found yourself a minion. And if your head wasn't spinning about spectrums already, I'll add that participatory design in itself is actually seen on one side of the spectrum. So this is a diagram by Liz Sanders from 2008. And I love this because we're actually starting to map our design practice on spectrums, but you can also see that there's so much duality within this with the way that those Venn diagrams actually overlap as well. Now I'm going to layer another spectrum. Do you see a pattern here? And Berlin actually touched on this in the very beginning, which was talking about generalists versus specialists. As generalists, as jack of all trades, Renaissance people, we're getting that push, right, to go that direction. But we also know that there's so much to be said about specializing and developing that particular craft. And so this really leads me to think about our T-shaped skill set, right? We're already trying to find this balance. But the other thing about this is that there is a limited amount of breadth and there is a limited amount of depth. I can only stretch my hand so far and I clearly can't grow any taller. Something to remember. We can't be everywhere all at once. Now, how do we start to use automation to help us either get more generalist or more specialized in our skill set? How do we start to specialize in our craft by choice rather than by being pushed? Again, we're going to start to think about how we bring in people to these problems. Do we do it as individuals? Do we do it as teams? I think we all hate death by collaboration or design by consensus, but we also know that our voices are quite powerful. And so when we put this on a spectrum, I think it really helps us think about, are we supporting an individualistic society or a collectivist society? As a design society, what are we actually choosing here? And I really love this example from Daniel Stillman from his book, Good Talk. And he talks about designing conversations and facilitation. And I love this because this illustration shows the lines of conversation between each participant as the number of participants grow. And as the head count grows, you see how complex it can become, how these connections clearly have power, but also complexity. So as we layer these spectrums of skill sets, tools, and then people, how do we find that balance between scalability and stability within our creativity? I'm going to leave you with this one, which is the answer that everybody loves. It depends. This is borrowed from one of my IXDA members, Ben Pekatich. He's awesome. He has this printed on a shirt and wears it everywhere. It's so cool. And creativity also depends. You have to understand the context in which it's applied and how you're balancing those spectrums. So as we hurdle ourselves towards the future, we really start to evaluate our sunk costs. When do we work on something that's legacy and we want to try to bring it into the 21st century? For me, I'll say 20th century because aviation tech is in the 18th century, versus creating something brand new from scratch. And so as we're thinking about this and putting this on a spectrum, I think there are two words that every designer loves: digital transformation. So powerful. And so I want to borrow from another Japanese concept that's actually used in cartography, which is the pin on the map saying you are here. And that effectively says, start where you are. I think as designers, we're really great at building out this beautiful vision, and we actually can't communicate the pathway to get to that vision. So I don't want to think about whether you're building something old or something new, but you have to start where you are regardless, because there is history here. Now, the other spectrum I want to talk about is a bit more personal to me, and it's a cultural spectrum. So having lived in Australia, I have realized that there's a saying, she'll be right. What happened? She'll be right. You know, okay. Letting things fall where they may. This is very different from how I spent most of my life growing up, which was in the States, where you are required to label every emotion because it is linked to your social identity, right? So let's put those on a spectrum, right? Figuring out when you can let things go and things will happen versus labeling every emotion and being very specific about it. So we can start to layer this with our previous spectrum. You can say, okay, how do you strategically build something? When will things fall into place? And when do I really have to push towards it? And again, we're going to layer time with this, but it's going to be a little bit different than the time example used previously. In Greek, there's a concept of chronos versus kairos. Chronos means clock time. So this is time that can be measured in seconds, minutes, hours, days. And then you have kairos, which is lived time. And this is actually a qualitative measurement of time that measures the moment. It basically refers to the opportune moment to do something. So when we see this on a spectrum, it's actually, again, something we already do. As facilitators, we're really familiar with this. We know when we need to speed up the agenda because everyone needs to eat lunch at 12 because everyone's getting really hangry and you need the extra 15 minutes to set up the room for the next thing. We know this. But we also know when it's possible to create the space for dialogue, when the quietest person in the room is starting to open up and voice their fears and their risks about strategically committing to something, right? So we're already starting to do this. And so when you layer these spectrums on each other again, where do you sit? Where does your creativity sit? And I want to leave you with this phrase that I'm trying to champion this year, which is blank enough, right? We're iterating on our processes of iterations, right? Quite meta. But are you creative enough? Are you good enough? Are you fast enough, right? And I think this is something as a society, especially after the pandemic and COVID, we're really thinking about. So, I've talked about halves and spectrums and shoe horses, but I want to end with a really, really tangible example here. So this is a persona that I've pulled off the Interaction Design Foundation website. And you can see here that we're clearly using spectrums on this persona. We're categorizing people in different ways. Now, personas are intended to take examples from the user group and really help us humanize a person. But in doing so, are we just averaging people together? Are you an average? And if we start to turn those spectrums back on ourselves and in the ways that we work, how are you communicating your progress and celebrating your failures? How are you finding your flow? Where are you in your career? What wisdom have you gained? And what kinds of problems are you tackling? Are you embracing automation or furthering your craft in some way? What part of your tea are you growing and why? What is your role in an individualistic versus a collectivist society? How are you navigating towards progress? Where are you in letting things go versus labeling every emotion? Are you by the clock, or are you finding the opportune moment? And I believe that this is not how you find the version of creativity, but your version of creativity. So on my journey of creativity, I have to acknowledge that I am all of these things. And that third culture could probably be fourth, because now I live in Australia, right? You with me? I am also all of these things. And you can start to see my intersectionality come alive here. But I also have to acknowledge that I am all of these things. So while Jonathan talked about doing hula hoops on the ground, I regularly hang from a hoop from a ceiling called a lyra. I'm an aerialist. And this is my version of creativity. And I think the thing that no one wants to talk about is that it's uncomfortable to think that I live, exist, can be in both, all, and in between spaces. In today's world, we default to homogeneity or to polarized opposites because that's easier. And our brains have a bias to focus on the avoidance of immediate discomfort. So I really encourage you to choose courage over comfort. Don't think about personas, think about the mindset of who you are and how you're applying that to your work. Don't make prototypes, make provotypes that provoke people. And subsequently, think about how you're applying that to your creativity. Thank you.